Hey, how's it going, guys? It's your boy. Now, I was thinking about free speech recently because Sargon posted a little snippet of a video on a podcast he was on, and they were talking about free speech. And there was a comment thread where they were just talking about America and Britain and how, freedom of speech isn't great at the moment in this country, in case somebody did notice. And there was a guy who was expressing doubts. And I believe he was more on the right, actually, than the left. Although, I'm not sure. It might have been somebody else. The comment thread got a little bit confusing because some of the avatars were similar. But this guy was basically saying, and both of them did say things along the lines of, well, in Britain we have free speech, sort of, which is true. It's sort of, that isn't free speech. But it just isn't. Basically, what one of them said, he was the more right of the two. I assume he was probably more centre or left. This guy I'm confusing, his politics with, I don't know. I don't care. Doesn't matter. One of them said, I said some pretty alt-righty type things on Facebook and in public and with friends, and I've gotten away with it. Whereas people like Tommy Robinson, people with influence, essentially, they have to look out more because, well, they're more dangerous to the government, more dangerous to groups, more dangerous to people with agendas and think tanks and organisations compared to some guy on the street. I mean, let's be honest, even though people are being arrested, because this guy did kind of downplay the threat to the common man, because as we know, there's been a couple thousand people arrested by Her Majesty's police force for saying things online. Most of that is, I would say, troll behaviour, not necessarily things to do with politics, but that is obviously one of the things as well. And we have seen high-profile cases, like a woman being arrested for perverting the cause of justice because she tried to get a police officer to do his job and stop people from praying in the middle of a park where they're not supposed to, because I think it's something to do with environmental laws, or maybe it was a health hazard, or it's just some rule that's always been there in London. I think it was Speaker's Corner, and these people, Muslims, were getting away with it, essentially, and the police officer saying, oh, they can do whatever they want because my boss says so. Yeah, it's not, the common man isn't entirely safe, but they're just lower on the list of problems that the government is facing at the moment. Whereas people like Tommy Robinson, people like Mufasil Islam, not me, Sargon definitely, although he seems to be lucky in the sense that they haven't gone after him just yet, but the more public he becomes, the more in the open he becomes, he's going to start seeing problems. I mean, I think you have to have connections in order to be safe, I think. This other guy then started to say, oh, it's bullshit because I'm not seeing, because it's not happening to me, it's not happening to people that I know, these are just isolated incidents. And then somebody also pointed out, well, in America, the media ignore the First Amendment and just try to stop people from saying what they want to say, which brought two interesting points about the destruction of free speech in the West. Now, they then also went on about things to do with the Second Amendment, which was kind of off topic, and I don't want to get into that. But it's the way in which free speech is being curtailed in America and Britain, whereas in the universities it's pretty much the same, because it's the same types of people in power, pretty much, so they do the same things because they're in the same ideology. They're all far leftists. That's what far leftists do. That's what they do in universities. They create bullshit laws or rules. They enforce them through student power, which can get out of hand, like an evergreen, and things like that. But when it comes to the government or other things like the media, or even normal people, there's a slight difference. Because in Britain, we don't have a written constitution, therefore it's a lot easier for the government to get rid of things. But they can't do it in one fell swoop, because then they'll be found out to be the liberty-hating con artists that they are. But that's not how people take rights away in history in general, unless either one, the person who takes these rights away is brave and has a lot of power. So, for example, a conqueror, someone with a lot of military might, can and will take these rights away. Usually you would see that in the medieval era, but you don't really see that now in the modern era because, well, we live in democracies now, and we live in different times where that isn't possible. So what do governments do? How can they get more power and take people's rights away without making it look like that it's an authoritarian shift? Well, it's gradual. These things happen in gradual ways. It's similar to conquest in many ways. Not all conquests were big offensives, no. Sometimes it takes a subtle case of just, I don't know, America sending some people over to Hawaii who then overthrow the Queen and then ask to be invaded. It's things like that. And I'll give you another case. In Britain, our self-defence laws, our gun laws, our right to bear arms didn't just disappear in one night. It happened gradually over centuries. Now, we didn't really have a big gun culture anyway, although we did have, back in the day, a big emphasis on bows and swords. But in terms of gun culture, people like shooting, people like hunting, but again, we were only limited to hunt certain things, and for the most part, we didn't have a frontier like America or Canada did, so there was less emphasis on people owning guns. Even criminals in the Victorian era didn't actually own much guns, which is another reason why the British police is often unarmed, although they're much more armed now than they were back then, because they didn't need to be against criminals who most likely were as unarmed as they were. There was just no need. And so it was much easier for the British government to basically creep in laws that governed what you could and could not own. But another thing was, in our Bill of Rights in 1689, it explicitly states that we can have the right to bear arms, and we do have the right to bear arms. So they had that little problem to address, but because it's an unwritten constitution, it was a lot easier to get rid of than, say, in America, where they probably will never get rid of it, thankfully. So you're probably wondering, in person, I think the law might have been even more strict now than it was back in the day, but I'll get to that. There's a law in Britain that states you can't have a knife over a certain couple of inches. I think it's quite small. Is it 5? Is it 1? I can't remember the exact size. That didn't come in recently. Well, for an historian, such as myself, it is recent, but we're talking 60 years ago. This was a 1950s law. This is when the Empire was still a thing. The so-called good old days. That's when they enacted that law, and it only became gradually more and more strict, to the point where the types of handheld weapons you could own and carry on your person began to be essentially cracked down upon. But you could still own guns. You could still own handguns. You could still own rifles. I think it depended on the type of handgun and rifle, obviously, much like in America. And then events happened where these things were slowly eroded. In the 80s, this is during, again, Margaret Thatcher's time, and again, the good old golden days weren't so golden. There was one mass shooting in Britain, and this was what made her ban people having rifles unless they were considered antiques or obsolete. So I think with a license, or I think it might depend on how old the gun is, I cannot legally own a rifle unless I'm part of a shooting club and I have a license as a result of that. That came in because of her, and that was under the pretense that no mass shootings will ever happen again. If we ban all these rifles, even though we didn't have a history of mass shootings, they did happen, but were extremely rare. And this was like probably one of the few, if one of the only things that happened in the 80s, probably one of the few in the 20th century even. If we're not counting stuff that happened in Northern Ireland, which is, again, a whole other kettle of fish. But that was her rationale for doing that. Do you think that was the real reason? Of course not. They're trying to erode the Bill of Rights, so it's much easier to control the population. And Tony Blair later on extended that to handguns. And wouldn't you know, violent crime, gun crime, funnily enough, rose. But it was already on the rise anyway in certain areas, like in Manchester, due to the hacienda and things like that. But that's besides the point. That made it even worse. And then eventually it kind of trickled down, because as we know, crime on the whole has been going down. But that's It has fits and spurts. And now recently we've seen laws in regards to buying edged weapons or just edged things in general. You know, the whole butter knife meme. Those laws are more likely to harm businesses than criminals. So basically, you cannot go to a place and order it online and expect the Royal Mail or whoever to bring it to your door anymore. Nope, you have to go to that place, which is, well, if it's an online service, it's impossible. But anyway, you can see my point, that long-winded point. These things happen in slow spurts. And with free speech, it's the exact same thing in Britain. Slowly but surely, over time, most of it, I think, was probably due to some good intentions on the part of some ministers, but let's be honest, if they've got some agendas and they've got some ties with certain groups, it's in their best interest to limit speech on certain things. And so it started off with these laws coming in, I think the Equalities Act as well, and things like that. It began to curtail things that you could and could not say to people. And I think again, it always happens when events happen which set precedents. There was a Stephen Lawrence case in London, I do believe, in 1993-94, where a black youth was attacked. I think he was stabbed, and the police were called, and let's be honest, they neglected him. Those two police officers essentially allowed him to die. This is completely different to the Rayshawn Childs case, where he basically killed himself. He ran away from the police, whereas Stephen Lawrence did not run from the police. Again, he was stabbed by somebody else, and the police neglected to do their duty to save him. And in Rayshawn Childs' case, they tried to resuscitate him. They had loads of paramedics, but he died on the scene or died shortly afterwards. This was a thing used to investigate the police to see if there was any institutional racism. There was found to be, although watching from Oozaloo's recent stream with some police officer, he said that should be doubted. But again, he's a police officer. I don't trust the police. Even ones who are trying to reform it and saying, agreeing with everything that I think about the police right now, don't trust a cop. I'm only slightly kidding. But that was used also to curb speech, because that was the first time in Britain, at the very least, we started seeing that offence and racism is in the eye of the beholder. So the guy who did the initial investigation, he defined offence and racism as something that somebody perceives it to be. And so that was probably where the police officer was coming from, where he was simply looking for the racism, and he found it because he had this new definition, which is now the definition in law, I do believe. And this is where we are now. The government here, as well as the media, as well as people as well, because people also believe you should be put in jail for that shit. You shouldn't be allowed to say these things. In America, it's different. You're safe for now, but come on, in your universities as well as ours, and perhaps even in real life, in the streets, you can't really be honest about what you really think because of the media and because of your social fabric, as well as ours, has affected that. Because the American media and the university system and these people who live amongst you have been creating this hostile atmosphere, and it's all across the West. I'm not saying that it's your problem specifically, it isn't. But this is how your freedom of speech is being eroded, because they can't really do it by law. I guess they could try to make some amendments or some kind of law that might make things kind of illegal. I don't know how they would do it, but I guess they would try, but they can't. So they try to do it through social means. The media will say, you can't say this, you can't say that, because if you do, you are this. So if you say America first, MAGA, you're a Nazi, things like that. If you disagree on how the border control should work, if you disagree with how society should be run, you will be deemed as such, and people will hound you, and people will ostracize you, and things like that. And it makes you quiet. It might even make you subservient. And that's why people wrongly predicted the American election, and even Brexit, and even some of the last elections in Britain, because people aren't allowed and are discouraged from saying what things that they truly think. And that's dangerous, and that leads people, especially on the left, that everybody agrees with them unless they're a Nazi. You see where I'm getting at? Free speech over there is curtailed through bullying, through ostracization, through social means. Even if legally you still have it, and you will see people talk about things in America that you don't usually talk about here. But it's the flip side. The people who have influence in America are far more safe than people like Tommy Robinson over here. Whereas the people of America are probably, although obviously not as much as Britons, obviously they're far more likely to be attacked for saying things and doing things that people who are the opposite number don't like. For example, Jeremy, the quartering, got assaulted, was it 24 hours ago, 2 days ago, simply because he is an opponent of social justice in gaming. That's why that guy attacked him, because they're on opposite sides of a culture war. That is why he got attacked. And that's what the Americans are forced to do, the far left or even far right Americans. That's what they have to do. That's why McCarthyism wasn't enacted into law, because legally you can be a communist and spout communist drivel, but the only way to get rid of a communist is to socially get rid of you. That's why they were blacklisted in Hollywood. That's why he went around and created loads of witch trials and things like that. Even though he was right that there were communist spies in America, and some people that said they weren't communists were communists, there were Russians who were capitalist spies as well in Russia. Everybody spies on everybody. That doesn't mean that we create this scare and witch hunt to fight the Cold War. We should not become the communists in order to fight the communists. I think that was what a lot of people were trying to tell him, but he didn't quite get the memo, even though he was trying to do what he thought was right. So there we go. I know it was a bit of a long ramble. Here's why we really need to protect free speech. This is why we need to be careful. These slow, grinding laws that grind everything down to the point that eventually, even though we're not at the point in the country where, or even in America, where we have to be careful because they might be listening on the telescreen, we're not far off, really. If you think about it, in Britain, we're really not that far off from the government potentially deciding, yeah, you know what, a Gestapo type police service would be a good idea. And the thing is, it wouldn't be hard for them to implement, not because of the unwritten constitution, but because, let's be honest, a lot of people in this country would support that, in my opinion. I have met too many who agree that people who have nasty opinions should be censored. They don't say it in that way. They say it in a sense of, we have to protect these certain groups because what these people say and what they advocate for, even though what they say and what they advocate for will never, ever become a feature in this country because, well, we fought a war against certain groups, and also in the 60s and 70s, during the height of racial tensions in this country, to a lesser extent in the 80s, the white community overwhelmingly rejected the white supremacist, white nationalist movements. So they have nothing to worry about. But you might just see that happen the more you ostracise these people and remove their free speech, and remove my free speech as well, because they're forgetting. Just because these people aren't being allowed to say things also means that you can't say things, because you are also beholden to these laws. It's a self-defeating thing. These people are trying to help these other people, but really they're damaging everybody, and also protecting certain classes that we just can't talk about on here. But anyway, let me end it there before I start repeating myself and making this ramble on even more. So until next time, it's been your boy, and I'll see you later.